Hi, welcome to the first lecture of Advanced Strategy and Analytics. My name is Steven, and I'm really excited to jump into this course with you guys. I'm very passionate about both the topics of strategy and analytics. I believe that at its essence, strategy is all about how to make choices, and as humans, choices are a fundamental aspect of our existence. And so I think it's really cool that the discipline of strategy really addresses that head on, as well as data. I feel like data at its essence, data and analytics at its essence is really just the discovery of truth in its most pure state. And I also believe that is another huge aspect of life. So, and when you put that together, making choices and using truth, I think they go in hand in hand. So I'm really excited to get started with this course with you guys. So our first lecture is going to go over general strategic theory. So the agenda for this course is we're going to start off by defining at a higher level what is strategy. Then we're going to go into strategic formulation, getting a little bit more granular, talking about the semantics between strategies, plans, and actions. Then we're going to take a really deep dive into why strategies exist and talk about what I believe are the three essential variables to why there even is existence and why strategy is practical and needed, which is state, value, and time. And then finally, we'll look at some slides about application of how you can take all of this theory and then actually apply it to the real world. Okay, so this slide goes over a very broad and general history of strategy. Feel free to skip this slide. None of this information is necessarily important for this course, but this is here for your interest. The main takeaway from this slide is to know that strategy can be traced all the way back to early Chinese and Greek generals. However, we really didn't see it applied to the field of business management until the late 1900s. And this lecture will draw mainly from the works of Joseph Schumpeter, Nelson and Winter, and Michael Porter. Looking at the timeline, I split it up into three main segments: military and political strategy. This is when we saw kind of the origins of strategy, but before applied to business. This is this period where economics really started to develop, and then finally a period I'm dubbing strategic management, when the actual field of strategy became a discipline. Starting off, going back all the way to 600 BC with Sun Tzu. Now, all these are very much oversimplifications, but I just want to give you a general idea of the history. So, Sun Tzu he really contributed to the field of strategy in the way of highlighting the importance of knowing basically where your position is and where everybody else is positioned, and really orienting what your goals are. He has this famous saying, if you know your enemy and yourself. This is really captures the essence of strategy in knowing position. He also does go into logistics and overall how to sustain a military economy. Moving on to Thucydides, he was an Athenian historian and general. He really stressed the importance of realism, which is really a precursor to irrational agent behavior that would become a foundation for modern economics. In the 1500s, we had Machiavelli, who really popularized the use of strategy in more the political sphere outside of just military. One of the things that he talked about a lot was the ends justifies the means and how to really be goal-oriented. Now, I know this sometimes does get a bad rap, but if you really think about it, when a company sets its goals, it should if it sets its goals properly, then yes, the ends should justify the means. But if the means produce an output that is not in line with what a company wants, then in reality, the company failed to set goals. Think about it this way. If a company sets the goals to be profitable or to increase profits, then what they're basically saying is they are sacrificing basic ethics and other things that society finds valuable just for the sake of attaining higher profits. Rather, a company should set a goal to be add and contribute value to society. And part of achieving that goal, a byproduct of it, is getting higher profits. So I just think that's interesting how that can be perceived sometimes. Moving on to the 1700s with Adam Smith, who's known as the father of modern economics. He really developed the ideas of competitive advantage as well as rational agent decision making, which essentially means that different different players within a market will have different specialties and they'll have different strengths and weaknesses, as well as also everybody tries to act in their own self-interest and they make choices that will the most benefit themselves. Now, continuing in the economic period, in the 1940s came around Schopenhauer. Now, Schopenhauer really did lay the foundation for modern strategic theory. What Schopenhauer proposed was that rather than competition driving the market, it was innovation that really creates economic value. It's not that somebody creates the perfect form of a current product. That's not what creates economic value, but rather it's when somebody invents a new product. That is what, and destroys the old product. That is ultimately what contributes value to society. And this is known as creative destruction. If you think about the cell phones, for instance, the smartphone that you have was not brought about by somebody trying to make the perfect flip phone, but rather somebody exploring the new possibilities of creating a different product and innovating, and from that innovation came the smartphone. Now, with the smartphone moving forward, that ended up destroying the flip phone industry. However, with the release of the smartphone, that created intense economic value to society. Now, moving into the strategic management period, Alfred Charles Chandler was the first to really coin the term strategic management. And this is important because it really stirred up the literature to start to actually consider strategy a discipline within the business world. Now, going into Nelson and Winter, a lot of the more deeper parts of this lecture is going to be based off of Nelson and Winter's work. What Nelson and Winter did was they applied the theory of evolution to economics, which essentially what they proposed was that agents don't necessarily make the most rational decisions, but rather they have decision rules that they use when they make decisions. And when those decision rules fail them, then they'll explore new policies or new rules or new strategies to be able to better get what they want. A brief example of this is when you walk into the grocery store, if we follow the classical model of economics, it states that you, as a rational agent, should go through and evaluate every single product in that grocery store, determine the utility of every single product, and then calculate which has the best return on investment given the price of that product. Now, the reality is nobody does that. Nobody walks into a store, evaluates all the possible things they can buy, and then figures out, okay, this is going to give me the most utility for the amount of money I'm paying, so I'm going to buy that product. Rather, what Nelson and Winter are proposing is that you walk into a grocery store, you have a heuristic, you have a strategy. You've already kind of determined, okay, these are the products that I regularly buy because they provide the most utility to my life. And you're going to continue moving forward with that policy until, for whatever reason, that policy doesn't do you well and you find out that this product doesn't really provide utility to you. Then you're going to abandon that policy, and then you're going to search for a new product and then make a new policy that will replace that old policy. So it's the idea of is whether it's really comes down to explore or exploit. Do you stay with your current choices, Or do you stay with your current heuristics, or do you explore new heuristics? And finally, Michael Porter, who is probably the most famous for strategy. If you have an introductory strategy course, you usually go over the content that you cover in that course will usually go over the Porterian view of strategy. What Michael Porter was most known for is he introduced the value chain, the market forces, and generic business strategies. Basically, the value chain just shows how value starts at the back end of a firm and how a product will go through a firm. Value is added and then it comes out and it's sold on the market. Market forces is a model to determine basically how attractive an industry is and what are the different forces that apply pressure on it to create either higher profits or lower profits. And the generic business strategies break into the whether or not you're taking a cost strategy where you're trying to sell things for cheaper than your competitors, or you're going on a differentiation strategy where you're selling a product that serves on different features than your competitors. But yeah, Michael Porter's work has made the field of strategy very easy for managers to take and apply, and a lot of strategic work is built off of what he has put forth. But that is a quick history of strategy for you in a single slide. So on this slide, I collected the definitions of strategy by different professors. And if you ask anybody, it seems like everybody has their own definition of a strategy. But what you'll notice is that common definitions of strategy all share this theme of describing position and action. If we look at Jeff Dyer's definition, Jeff Dyer teaches the introductory level strategy course here at BYU. He is also famous for his work on innovation. He worked closely with Clayton Christensen on The Innovator's DNA and other big prominent books and is well known throughout the strategy community. He states strategy as a dynamic plan to gain and sustain competitive advantage by asking these four questions. If you've ever taken a course at BYU on strategy, you're very familiar with these four questions. The questions are, where do you compete? What unique value do we offer to customers? How do we deliver unique value? And what do we do to block competition? Moving on to Clayton Christensen. Clayton Christensen was not a BYU professor, but he did work closely with Jeff Dyer, and he has worked with a lot of BYU professors in the past. He has, in my opinion, what I feel is the most simple and elegant definition of strategy, saying at a basic level, well, a strategy is determining what you want to achieve and how you will get there. And I love this because it really does describe the basics of position. What is your position? Where do you want to go? And the action of how to get there. Dr. Bryce teaches the second strategy theory course at BYU. He says some similar words, saying strategy is choosing where to invest and what action to take over time to create exemplary performance. Again, we have a where, we have a what, and then finally, James Oldroyd teaches the third strategy theory course here at BYU and also does the senior capstone class. And in his words, strategies is putting yourself in the best position to win. Again, we see the action of putting, and then we see a position that is entailed with that. Just breaking this down even more, at the highest level, the broad definition of strategy is how to win or how to achieve what you want to achieve. That breaks down into Clayton Christensen's definition of where or what and how, which then you can break down into Jeff Dyer's four different primary questions. And once you start asking these questions as a business manager, it really starts to get you a sense of what you need to do to be successful in your industry. When looking at where and what, for instance, you want to examine both the external position, where are you in the market, who are your competitors, so forth, and then the internal position, what are your resources and capabilities, what are your routines, how are you configuring things. When you're looking on how, you want to look at mainly how do we deliver value and then how do we sustain that value. So what do we do differently that actually produces value? How do we win with customers? What are the jobs to being done that we are doing for our customers? And then how are we going to maintain that value? How are we going to create barriers so our competition can't imitate us? Or how long can we exploit the current position that we are in? Asking all of these questions together gives you a sense of where your position is and what you need to do and how you can get there. And it is the key steps into being able to form a strategy. A useful exercise to do is once you ask these questions is then to map out what does the market map look like. And mapping something like this out really helps you to give a better idea of where you are and what you need to do. On this diagram here, this diagram I've based off of Porter's 5 forces model. And if you look at it the way it's laid out, so down here, basically products will move up this way through the different markets. And we would call that the products move vertically. And so we have a firm right here, and a firm will buy a product, will buy a resource from a supplier. The firm will then take that resource, whatever that resource is, add value to it, and then once it adds value to it, it will then sell that to a buyer. And so this is where value is creation. And this is sometimes referred to as upstream, and this is referred to as downstream. So that's the vertical axis. The horizontal axis here represents the competition, or you can even say different products or different markets. For instance, if you think of this as right here is the smartphone market, then perhaps you can think of over here as the tablet market, and over here as the PC market, where they aren't direct competitors with with smartphones. However, they are still adjacent. They still do perform similar things, but as the distance increases horizontally, then the jobs to be done of these products differ greatly. So it's important to identify what is the market, where do you compete in, what are the adjacent markets, who are your suppliers, who are your buyers, and who are your competitors. The way that Porter describes it as there are 5 forces you need to focus on when formulating a business strategy. 1, your rivals. 2, your buyers. 3, your suppliers. 4, possible new entrants, and 5, substitutes. And really what this all comes down to is you want to think about it as you want the ratio of suppliers and buyers to be as high as possible to the number of firms within the market. Because if there are 6 suppliers down here and only 1 firm here, that means you get to choose what supplier to do business with and you have more power over them. Same thing with buyers. If there's only 1 firm here and there are hundreds of buyers over here, all these buyers have to come to you and you have more power. However, if that's reversed and there's a lot of competitors in this space and there's only a few buyers, the buyers have a lot of power because they get to choose what firm they go to. And same thing for suppliers. If there's a lot of firms here and there's only a couple of suppliers, that means that the suppliers get to choose what firms they work with, and the suppliers have a lot of power. In addition, and a firm should also be aware of not only the competitors within the market, but also possible possible entrants outside that may be entering the market, or even substitutes in other markets, because that might also contribute to the ratio of firms to buyers and suppliers. In addition, if we look in here, this golden circle is where we do business strategy within. So normally that you can divide that usually up into two different categories, differentiation or cost advantage. And usually in order to obtain a cost advantage, you do so through reconfiguring operations, or to get a differentiation to compete on that side of things, that is usually done through marketing. So that is just a breakdown of how these strategies are carried out. Now on this red circle, this outlines corporate strategy. And corporate strategy is a little bit more broad. It doesn't get as nitty-gritty as business strategy does, where corporate strategy is more focused on moving vertically and horizontally between markets. So this is more, should we buy one of our suppliers? Should we buy one of our buyers? Should we buy a competitor? Should we move into adjacent markets? And so corporate strategy is much more focused on a higher level than where business strategy gets more into the granular of competing within a market, where corporate strategy is more how to compete within several markets simultaneously. Really, if you can understand this diagram here, you have a very good grasp of business strategy in, in one glance. Just the main takeaway I would say from this slide is you want to keep the ratio of firms in here as low as possible. You want to have the most buyers and suppliers as you can in order to create the most amount of profits within a market. Okay, and now we'll be moving on to formulation. Okay, so it's important to understand that strategies determine a methodology or a policy that clearly states how to make choices by basically describing what an objective is and how it should be achieved. And so you see this process here. You should start out with having a strategy. From that strategy, you will be able to create a plan of action or a sequential list of items that you should do. And then from that list, you can then move on and execute on that list that you have developed. If you've ever seen that diagram start with why, think about it how you start out with your why, and then that determines your how and your what. And this is the same thing for strategy. Strategy ultimately determines how you're going to do something and what is going to happen. I also want you all to notice the different roles of the types of people who are responsible for these different stages. Any company or any organization or even any task, whether it's your own personal life or a huge multi-billion-dollar organization, has to go through this process whenever action is being taken. You'll have a leader that determines a strategy. This leader needs to be able to have vision and be able to see the big picture. They define what the objective is, and they define what is going to be the criteria for being able to achieve that vision. That will then get passed on to a manager. A manager will take whatever the strategy is and create a plan for it. They will organize and prioritize tasks into a way that will most effectively get things done. If you've read 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, think as strategy as habit 2, which is start with the end in mind, and then plan as habit 3, which is put first things first. This is doing the right thing. This is doing things right. Now, once managers make plans for how a strategy is to be executed, it is then passed on to workers who then exercise discipline and have the necessary technical skills to follow through with what the plan has stated. Now, realize that sometimes you might have to play multiple roles. If you're an entrepreneur, for instance, you will have to play the role of the leader, the manager, and the worker, usually at the very beginning. If you are in an entry level position, you're probably only going to be playing the worker role, and that means that you should focus on being disciplined in your actions and having the necessary technical skill to be able to get done whatever you need to get done. If you're a manager, realize that your primary objective is to be able to organize and prioritize tasks based off the strategy so that the workers can get done the work. So you're going to need to know how to properly allocate resources in order to get something done. And then finally, if you're in a more senior level leadership position, you are required to see the big picture and to put together that plan and to have that vision. It is very easy for a leader to get caught up in over here when they're actually supposed to be here, especially for entrepreneurs, as they can oftentimes be spending too much of their time in here and not enough time in here. And while they might do good in the short term, failing to have a strategy can end up jeopardizing their business in the long term. So just a really quick recap of everything. A strategy determines what the objective is, where and how to get there. The plan is then the organization of tasks that will lead to that objective according to the decision criteria set by the strategy, and the execution is the actual realization or carrying out of those tasks that are listed out on the plan. So a good strategy gives good choice making criteria by clearly stating where and how. This will then lead to plans which states what the choices are. So here is an analogy we're going to use to be able to help understand the differences between strategies and plans. And before I get started, I do want to put out a way that if you do look up some definitions of strategies, they will say a plan to create or sustain and capture value. I just want to point out that we are using a different definition of plan here. When I refer to plan, I mean a sequential list of actions that are going to be taken. Those definitions of plan is more like a plan to plan, or if you would say a second degree level plan. So looking at these boats, let's say that all of these boats had the objective of to move to the lighthouse in the center. So we look at boat one. Boat one's strategy is to always move towards the lighthouse. We have where it wants to go, the lighthouse, and how it's going to get there. Always move. So at its current position, its plan is to move 2 miles south. So we go on to boat two. Boat two's strategy is the same as boat one's. Its strategy is also to always move towards the lighthouse. However, its plan is different than boat one because it has a different position than boat one. So its plan is to move northwest 3 miles. And this is where strategy is different from plans. Strategy defines the criteria for making the decision, where the plan is the actual decision is made. Notice that both these boats have the exact same strategy, but because they're in different positions, they have different plans. Moving on to boat three, we looked at boat three has a little bit more of a dynamic strategy. It will always move towards the lighthouse, but it'll also avoid obstacles. So this allows boat three to be more dynamic in the case that if boat three was placed in the same position as boat one, it would have the exact same plan as boat one. However, its strategy also accommodates for other obstacles in the way. If boat one was placed here, it would fail because it would run into the obstacle, where boat 3 has a more dynamic strategy that allows it to accommodate for the obstacle. And finally, if we look at boat 4, it uses a completely different technology as the other boats. So its strategy is to also, instead of moving towards the lighthouse, its strategy is to move towards the nearest air current and use it then to move towards the lighthouse. So the main takeaway should be from this analogy here is that strategies and plans are different. Strategies help you to define plans. Strategies are usually unchanging unless if there's huge drastic changes in the environment. They usually stay pretty stable and they guide you and they provide a way for you to know how to make choices. Plans will always change and they should constantly change. Plans should be agile to accommodate for changes in position or changes in the environment. So I hope that gives you an abstract overview of really what is strategy and how it differs from a plan. Believe it or not, a lot of businesses make the mistake of making a plan and calling it a strategy. Here is an example of that. This is a more real application of what a good strategy is and what is not a good strategy. Remember that strategies should clearly state where and how so they can translate into plans, else they lose their utilities. I'm going to read off both the strategies of Tesla and Netflix, and then I want you to think about which one is a good strategy and why. So if we look at Tesla, it states that Elon Musk stated that the strategy of Tesla is to enter at the high end of the market where customers are prepared to pay a premium and then drive down market it as fast as possible to higher unit volume and lower prices with each successive model. So that is Tesla's strategy. Now let's look at Netflix's strategy. They state in their 2019 annual report that Netflix's core strategy is to grow their streaming membership business globally within the parameters of their operating margin targets. So now let's go ahead and break down these strategies. Remember, we want to look for the where and the how in both of these strategies. So if we look at Tesla, we first look for the where. Where do they want to go? They want to get in a position where they are making models with higher unit volume and lower prices. That is their objective. That is where they want to be. They want to have high scale and low costs. How are they going to get there? Well, they're going to do so by entering at the high end of the market and then drive down market as soon as possible. So this is their pathway, how they are going to get to this position. This is a great strategy because it clearly states where they want to go and how they are going to get in there. And if this is passed on to a manager that can then translate that into a plan and execute on it for the business. Now, if we go over to Netflix and we look at Netflix's strategy, we want to look at where and how. So if we look for where, they want to grow their membership globally within the parameters of their operating margin. So that is where they want to go. However, they're not stating how they want to get there. They're just stating this is where they want to go. This is where they want to go. And their strategy does not really tell at all how they're going to get there. Because the strategy doesn't state where and how, it only states where, it can't really be translated into a plan of action, and therefore it loses its utility. Next time that you read an article or an annual report or a publication where a business is talking about their strategy, I really encourage you to try to identify the where and the how within their strategy statements and ask yourself, is this really a strategy or is it more of a statement or a plan that they're presenting forward? Okay, this next section is going to go very deep into the theory, exploring the question of why do strategies exist. And a lot of this content is based off of very fundamental economics and mathematics at its core. The most simple way I can explain this is the reason why strategies exist is first, because choices exist. Second, because agents that make choices value choices differently. And third, because a choice has a consequence and you can't go back in time. I know that this may seem obvious, however, being able to break this down is huge for being able to really understand and systematize the way that an agent goes about making actions or how they formulate a strategy. The reason why we are spending time on this is because a lot of analytics comes down to making getting the data necessary to make choices. And when we break this down into these fundamental levels, it almost allows us to automate the processes for being able to make strategies when we have the sufficient data that we need. I am not going to spend too much time on this slide simply because the next couple of slides are going to go into each one of these topics in depth, but the three different variables that we are going to be exploring are one, state, two, value, and three, time. Before I dive into this slide, I want to give you all the heads up that I am going to be drawing on examples from both LDS and Christian scripture in order to explain some of these concepts because my audience is primarily an LDS based audience and I want to use material that they are familiar with. However, I will say that just no matter what religion or whatever your beliefs are, whether you follow a faith or if you're atheist or agnostic, we can all agree on that there are some fundamental principles that do govern this universe. And oftentimes we see those principles in archetype form, and they will appear consistently across different narratives. Some of the best places to find these common archetypes of principles that we've observed to be true over millenniums are in ancient texts, such as religious scripture. So, whether you believe completely in just observing strictly these principles in a scientific lens, completely objectively without looking in any other religious source, or you take the way of personifying these principles onto a deity, and that helps you to better understand it. I think we can all benefit from looking at these principles and being able to try to apply it in different circumstances to general theories of how strategies exist. So now that I have that out of the way, let's get into states. So states are instances of existence. They represent existence. They represent an objective place that you can be within the realm of existence. In order for there to be states, there needs to be some kind of dimensionality. And in order for there to be dimensionality, there needs to be opposition. If you think about a dimension like as in a line on a graph, in order for you to have a dimension on a graph, it needs to have one end at the at positive infinity and one end at negative infinity. There has to be both of those opposites in order for that dimension to exist. If there isn't dimensionality, if there isn't that opposites, there is no dimensionality. If there is no dimensionality, you cannot measure anything and you can't state a position within that dimension. If you cannot measure things, things cannot be different. And if things cannot be different, everything would essentially be the same. One way to think about this is if you have a white sheet of paper and then you have a white circle on it. You cannot distinguish the white circle from the white sheet of paper, say they're the exact same color, because there's no dimension of color. In order for that circle to exist on that plane, there needs to be an opposite color from whatever the background color is, so that circle can be somewhere on that color, on that line of color, to be able to be different from whatever the, the background is. If you think about it, this is really what makes up the building blocks of the universe. You start out, you have one dimension in space, you can move left or right. You have another dimension in space, you can move forward or backward. You have a third dimension in space, all of a sudden you can move up and down and you could describe a position. Then you can have a dimension that describes if there is matter in a certain position or not. So this can be a 1 yes or a 0 no. So you can say at some point there is matter at that position. Then you can have another dimension that states which way is this matter or spinning. And I'm very much oversimplifying the quantum mechanics here, but you can say, is this matter spinning up or is it spinning down? Well, if it's spinning up, we can call this an up quark. If it's spinning down, we can call this a down quark. Now, if we have two down quarks together in one up quark, then we all of a sudden at this point of space we have a neutron. If we have two up quarks and one down quark, then all of a sudden at this position in space we have a proton, and from there we can start to build an objective reality. Now I know that's going pretty deep into it, so I'm just going to bring it back out. Essentially what a state is just think about it as a bunch of measurements. It describes, it can be your objective position in reality, it is what you are wearing, it is a color, it is something that is observable and that everybody will agree on. Another way to think about it is think about it as the independent variables in an equation. Okay, so moving on, for this section, we're going to be using what I'm calling the treasure field analogy to better understand these principles. And so here we have a field, and in this field we have a treasure chest, we have a fire, and we have an agent. Our agent here is the one that can make decisions. And so let's say that this agent wants to be able to orient himself in the environment that he's in. As of right now, we really do not have a good way to be able to define where this agent is, or where the fire is, or even where the treasure chest is. We can relatively say perhaps that this agent is below the fire, fire, the treasure chest is above the fire. Maybe the agent is a little bit to the left of the fire. The treasure chest is farther to the left of the fire. But our current model and our current view of this environment really doesn't give us a good way how we can describe the state of where the agent is. To solve this problem, we can add a state space to this environment to better be able to quantify the different choices that the agent has. So what we've done here is we've added two dimensions to this environment. We have this letter dimension here, and then we have a number dimension in here. And what this does is it allows us to now describe the position of where our agent is, where the fire is, and where the treasure chest is. This is good because now we have an objective way how to be able to describe where everything is. We also now know all the choices that are available to our agents. Our agent can choose to be in any one of these states, and we have a way of now defining it. Now, it's important to realize that this is a model, that that this agent probably does operate on a continuous analog spectrum. So for instance, it is possible to be in between states, but for the sake of simplicity in our model, we want to keep it so that the agent can only be in one state at a time. Think about it when you are making choices. Oftentimes, you will define it as you only have three different choices available to you. You can do option D1, you can do option E2, or you can do option F1. But the reality is you have an infinite possibility of choices. You can go here, 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 or here. However, the reason why we simplify things down is so it's easier for us to understand. So that is the overview of what a state is. Basically, it's just a way to describe a position in reality. That position can be anything from its actual physical position to a color to anything that you can throw on a dimension or any variable that you can really think of. One thing to note about states is they are objective, that no matter who you are, states are the same. Now, you might have limited information of a state, but a state represents objective shared reality. Next, moving on, in order for strategy to exist, states must have different levels of desirability within the perspectives of agents. Otherwise, choices would not matter at all. We naturally impose hierarchy onto all the states around us. One of the things, if you think back to the Genesis story with Adam and Eve, they were in the Garden of Eden. While they were in this garden, as the narrative puts it, they did not know the difference between good and evil until they partook of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. Once they partook of that fruit, the text reads that their eyes were opened and they knew the difference between good and evil. Now, if we back up to before in this narrative, Adam and Eve partook of the fruit, they could observe states. They could observe different things. One of the conditions that Adam and Eve were in while they were in the Garden of Eden is they were naked. And they knew this. However, they did not know if this was a desirable state or not. It wasn't until after they partook of the fruit, once they had this, they were able to know the difference between good and evil, that they realized that their current vulnerable state that they were in was highly undesirable. And because the current state they were in was highly undesirable, it caused them to take action to cover themselves. We see this as an echo of how we process and define reality. Now, while states are objective, remember that value is completely subjective. It is what we give to a state. It is the meaning that we give to an objective state. And by giving a state value, we naturally will make one state more desirable than another state. For instance, I'm going to use an extreme example, but for myself, I value the act of charity much higher than I value murder. Now, this is a clear hierarchy, and this is something that most people tend to agree on. And one of those, charity, is is widely accepted of being much more valuable than the act of killing people. However, hierarchy doesn't necessarily mean that one thing is better than another thing. In addition, I also value, for whatever reason, the color red over the color blue. This is just something that since I was a kid, I always liked the color red than the color blue. Doesn't necessarily mean that red is better than blue. However, that is the way that I value the um the universe around me, and therefore more often than not when I'm given a choice between colors, because I value the states of red and blue differently, that will affect my choice in which one I will pick. Because I value red more, I'm more likely to pick the red object over the blue object solely on the dimension of color. If we did not value different states differently, if we did not impose a hierarchy on the choices that we would have, then all of our choices would be meaningless and there really would be no point to existence. There would be existence because we do have states, but there would be no point or no meaning to it because nothing really matters since we do not value things any differently. For it wouldn't matter if I chose one choice over the other because to us they would be the same unless we have some value policy of how to determine what is important to us. And naturally, by determining what is important to us as an agent, that will then follow through to determine what actions we are going to take. Now, going back to the treasure field analogy, previously we did have states, but none of the states really mattered because we didn't have a way to value them. Now, if we take this concept of value, what we can do is we can start to value states differently. Now, from a high level, we can define that, okay, we're going to give the treasure chest a value of 10. Completely arbitrary, but that's what we're going to give it. Same thing with the fire. We're going to get it a negative 10 because we want to go to the treasure chest, but we want to avoid the fire. And what this does, it helps us define what state is desirable, what our objective is, and what our objective is not. Now you notice that we've only defined the value for two of the states within our environment. There are still all these other states that we have not yet valued. Now this is where things get tricky because we have the option, we have to figure out how we are going to value these different states. And based off of how we decide to value these other states will determine what actions the agent will take. So let's look at some examples about how we can go about valuing these different states. Okay, so the first approach that we can take, I'm going to call the reward seeking approach. And we are going to look solely at our reward, or we're going to look solely at our objective, and then we are going to discount each state by 1 from that objective. So as we move farther and farther away from the objective, the states will go down in value. So then our policy would be we would want to move into whatever state has the highest value. Another approach we can take, I'll call the risk-adverse approach. And rather than discounting all the states from how their proximity to where the treasure chest is, I'm going to give them a premium for how far they are away from the fire, meaning that our primary objective is that we want to avoid the fire at all costs. And you see all these states are now valued differently. And instead of being valued from how close they are to the treasure chest, they are valued by how far away they are from the fire. Finally, we can get a little bit more tricky. I'm going to call this the hybrid approach, and we're going to take a combination of the reward seeking approach and the risk adverse approach. I'm going to make the assumption that 90% of the time, the agent will move to wherever the desired location is. However, 10% of the time, it will move in a random direction. Therefore, 90% of the time, we do want to take the quickest path to the treasure chest, but we do want to account for that 10% variability of where we want to avoid it running into the fire. So I'm going to take a computational approach at valuing each one of these states by combining the two matrices on top of each other, and I am going to discount the risk-averse approach and bring it down to 10% of what its value is. So if I take all the values of both the reward-seeking approach and the risk-adverse approach, I will then get the following values as seen on in this environment, on this state space. So now if we take a look of all three of these approaches side by side, we can see the different actions that the agent will take with each approach. We notice that in the reward-seeking approach, the agent makes a straight path going straight directly to the treasure chest, but it has the chance of actually passing the fire and being quite close to it. Now, if we look at the risk-adverse approach, we see that the agent goes directly away from the fire, and this agent will probably never end up running into the fire, but also at the same time, it will never make it to the treasure chest. Finally, if we look at the hybrid approach, we see that the agent will not take the quickest path to the treasure chest necessarily. However, it will take a more safe path that guarantees it in the chance that there is variability in its movements, it will probably never fall into the fire pit. So what I want you to take away from this slide is in each one of these environments, we have the exact same states, we have the exact same environments, we have the exact same rewards placed on our different objectives. However, the way that the agent chooses to value the different states greatly impacts the decision it's going to make. Now, to apply this more to the real world, the discipline of finance is very much concerned um, with the ability to value different choices that is made. And oftentimes you'll see the ability of a firm to be able to accurately value what a potential project or investment, what its return on value will greatly influence its choices, and the better that a firm can value the different choices or the different investments that it can make, the better it will perform. If you remember from Dr. Bryce's class in Strategy 411, you had that one exercise where you had to perform financial analysis on different projects. The first analysis you performed was a typical net present value analysis, which you just looked at where the discounted cash flows of the project outweigh whether the initial investment cost that you would have to put for the different projects. And the answer to that came out to be a no, you shouldn't go ahead with that project. However, then you're required to do the same analysis, you're required to do analysis again on the same projects. However, instead of using the MVP analysis, you used a real options pricing model to be able to determine the different values of the projects. And when you use that approach, you were in addition to the discounted cash flows, also taking into account the opportunity cost. And what you found was while the discounted cash flows didn't show that you should go ahead with the different projects, the opportunity cost showed that you had the option to continue with the project. And since the first project was profitable, you could then choose later whether or not to go through with the second project. And therefore, it was a good investment because you had the option to get out of it if the project ended up to go south and still remain profitable. So the way a firm or an agent decides to value its different options or choices will greatly determine a strategy. So keep that in mind. So I wanted to show this to make a connection back to Strat 411. What I did was I took the hybrid approach and I graphed it out in three-dimensional space based off of its value. And what we created here was fitness landscapes, just like the ones that you learned about in Dr. Bryce's class. And now you can start to see how all of this ties in together. You can see how important it is to evaluate and to identify what options are available. Then to identify what are the values associated with those different choices. And once you do that, what you have done is created a landscape that you can then navigate. If you remember earlier in this lecture, we showed that Porter's five forces model where we had an entire market landscape. This is the exact same thing as that, only it goes into much more detail and can be applied in many more applications. At the root, this is what positioning is, and this is what strategy is being able to understand where you are within this landscape and what places are valuable and how you should navigate the choices that are presented with you to get to where you want to go. And finally, the final variable we'll be talking about is time. Now, this may seem overly intuitive, but you really need to have an appreciation for how fundamental time is to the existence of strategy. Now, time always moves forward. Because time always moves forward and you can't go back, that means that choices have consequences. That means that moving from one state to another state, you are going to realize the value of that state, and you cannot go back. Choices cannot be undone. Now you can move back to that previous state, but you'll never be in that same state again at that same time. If you think about it, if you're playing a game of chess on a computer, if you have undo, there's really no point to the game because you can undo all your actions. You don't need to have strategy because you can keep undoing your actions. The reason why strategy exists is because actions are irreversible and actions have consequences. You realize the value when you move from when you take an action and you move into a new state, and you accept that value, and you cannot return that value. Now, if time did not exist, obviously you cannot take action. You cannot move from state to state. You will be stuck. When you do take an action, there's accountability linked to that. For every action, there is a reaction that will happen. If you move from one state to another state, you are in a new state and you will inherit all the properties of that state. In addition, your current state that you are in is a consequence of your previous actions. Therefore, the state that you choose will determine what future options are available to you down the road. So returning to our treasure field analogy, we can see that the agent is currently here and it has three different options that it can choose from. It can either move into D2, E1, or C1. And based off its choice, that will determine the next set of options that it has, and the next set of options, and the next, and so forth. And by going one direction will mean that it may not be able to go another direction. For instance, let's say that this agent only had 8 time steps to live. If it does not choose D2 and then D3 within these first 2 time steps, it will never be able to reach the treasure chest just because it is too far away and it's out of reach. So the choices it makes up front will have effects on whatever choices it will have later on. And in this choice, if it does choose, say, E1, that is an irreversible choice. It cannot move back. It will not be able to reach the treasure chest because it went to E1. Now, it can perhaps go back to D1, but by the time it's in D1, it's already in time step 3. It can never go back to time step 1 and be in D1 again. It's also should be important to note that the farther out you project in the future, the less certainty you will have about certain states. The value of certain states is harder to determine the farther out they are in the future, and also in dynamic environments, states can change in value. Going on to this slide, this shows what examples of what dynamic environments may look like and how value and states can change over time. So both of these graphs, I believe, they're both fitness landscapes, and I believe that they are displaying the options of phenotypes for different bacteria. And you can see that as the bacteria is evolving, it is evolving and it is changing its different phenotypes to be able to obtain states that are more valuable for its survival in both of these. And you see as the bacteria evolves that the environment changes, where in this one, the environment is shifting more independently of the evolution of the bacteria, where in this landscape, as the bacteria spreads or as the bacteria changes its phenotypes, the fitness or the desirability of those phenotypes changes, or of those states changes. The key takeaway here is that values and states change over time, and that you have to take time into account. Also, by making choices within an environment, that might actually affect the value of other states within an environment if you had not taken those choices. So when navigating landscapes, you have to be very smart about how you go about getting to where you want to go. And this is the reason why strategy is so important, because navigating landscapes like these is very difficult. And lastly, it's important to also touch on path dependency and the Markov property. Like I said earlier, a lot of this is derived from heavy mathematics. I'm going to try not to get too technical here, but all what you really need to know is that your current state is a function of your previous state. And your current state determines what are the future possible states that you have available to you. Where you are right now is a function of your past, and where you can go is determined by the present. However, according to the Markov property, of your current choice set, the choice you end up choosing is independent of the past and is solely based on your decision policy. I know this is a little complicated, so let me try to simplify it. Where you are right now, you have a series of choices available to you. For instance, if you are sitting down in a chair right now watching this lecture, you have a couple choices. You can either keep sitting in this chair, or you can get up out of this chair, maybe move to the left or move to the right. That current set of choices is completely determined by your previous actions of choosing to sit down in the chair. Your previous action of choosing to sit down in a chair has determined what choices are currently available to you right now. However, of those current choices, whether or not to keep sitting in the chair or to get up and move to the left or to get up and move to the right, of those choices, which one of those choices you choose is completely independent of the past and is completely based off of whatever choice criteria you made. It doesn't matter if you got into this if you have been getting into this chair and every time that you get up from this chair for the past year that you move to the right, that will have no impact on whether or not you choose to get up out of this chair and move to the right or move to the left. The choice of Your choice of choosing whether to move to the left, get up out of this chair and move to the left or move to the right is completely determined by whatever your internal decision policy is. Now, of course, if you have for the past year got up out of your chair and you always move to the right, then there's a strong chance that your decision policy is to get up to the chair, get up out of the chair and move to the right. However, that is unknown, and it could quite be that you have a decision policy where on the 100th time when you get up out of a chair, you decide to move to the left, where all the other 99 times you choose to move to the right. To try to sum this all up for you, basically the current choices you have is completely determined by your past actions, by the past actions of an agent. However, of the choice set that you currently have, the choice that you choose is completely independent of the past and is determined by your choice-making policy. Okay, that wraps up the deep theory portion of your lecture. Hope that wasn't too much. Glad that you were able to make it this far, and thanks for sticking around. We'll now be going into more application and taking some of the theories that we talked about, and I'll try to demonstrate how this applies to the real world and how this applies to strategy and how you can convey this information to, say, a manager. So going back here, we have our treasure field analogy. We have the treasure chest here. We have our fire here. We have the possible choices of this agent, and we have value for these choices. So if I was trying to advise this agent on what to do, I would probably use a graph like this that demonstrates you should move to state D because state D has the highest value. We can take that exact same methodology, however, apply it to a business situation. Here, I just reconfigured some of the icons in our treasure field analogy. Instead of having an agent, we have a firm. Instead of having a fire, we have bankruptcy. Instead of having a treasure chest, we have the position of being a market leader. And of these choices, these are possible acquisitions that this firm can take. This firm is trying to expand horizontally, and it is looking at 3 different companies to acquire. These represent the different choices that this firm can take. I can use the same type of graph that I used in the previous slide to show this firm what I would advise it to do given the landscape that it is in. Look how that previous environment analysis then can translate into a slide like this. This is very much something typical that you would see in a management consulting presentation in advising a client on which acquisition they should acquire. Here's another example. Again, we can show that this agent within this environment should continue to move along this path because this is the path that will reward it with the most amount of value. Now, swapping this back to our firm model, we can see that this path is the best path for it to go on because it will lead to the greatest investment opportunity. And we can display that with this graph over here. We can then translate that graph into this slide, which is another slide that could be very typical for you to see in a consulting deck. And this slide shows why this acquisition should be made because of the investment over the long run. I hope that this helps show you how, even though we did go into all that very deep theory, how if you can understand that theory on a more basic level, then be able to apply that theory to whatever environment an agent is in, whether that's a firm, yourself, or whatever you're trying to figure out, you can then use that analysis. You can use that as a base point to do analysis, and then from that analysis, make a strategy, and then be able to turn that strategy into something like this to be able to effectively convey it. I hope this lecture was useful. I know that it's very much in the theory, but this is how you take that theory and then give it real world application. And this is a good segue into our next lecture, because the next lecture will be going over how to create effective slides like this.